Well, before I start, I just want to very quickly mention my other favorite landlocked country, which is Nepal, and which is suffering very, very much right now. And the area that I worked in Nepal with Educate the Children, we've just heard today that the village, there's not a single house standing. So I just want to urge all of you to do whatever it is you can do to be supportive to Nepal. It's very strange when one of these massive events happens in a place that you actually have been, that you actually know and you know people. It's a whole other level of disturbing. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Bolivia. So shortly after I fell in love with Bolivia some 30 years ago, I began to realize how emblematic it was of much of the global South. 500 years of relentless extraction of silver, tin, and now natural gas had left an indelible imprint on the economy and the natural landscape. Most Bolivians, now a population close to 10 million, had seen little, if any, of the benefits, whether the country was run by Spanish or Bolivian elites, or whether the export economy was controlled by Spanish, English, or U.S. capital. Bolivia followed the boom and bust cycles of monoproducer economies with infrastructure built for export and private companies that virtually ran the country according to their own interests and very often their personal whims. The political instability so often associated with countries dependent on resource extraction is common in Bolivia too, which has had one of the highest numbers of coups d'etats in the world. The last round endured 18 years, coming to an end in 1982. Bolivia also struggled with the poverty so often associated with landlocked countries. Losing its access to the sea in 1884 in a disastrous war with Chile is a wound that remains unhealed, in no small measure because it provides an explanation of why Bolivia has been condemned to greater poverty than any of its neighbors. Bordered by 5 countries and created as a buffer state, the country has always been poorly consolidated. It has steadily lost territory throughout its history to more powerful neighbors and has long provided a route across South America for smuggled goods from gold to cocaine to television sets. Largely rural until about 1960, its countryside also suffered one of the highest rates of rural poverty in the world, as the limited resources were concentrated among a tiny, urban, white elite. Bolivia is not only South America's poorest country, it is also its most indigenous and one of its most unequal. But aside from spectacular mountains tumbling into jungle and temperate valleys, Bolivia had another appeal for me. The first morning I was there, I was poring over a copy of a left-wing paper, Aquí, wondering how it could possibly be that in this country with constant protests and uprisings, that a revolution wasn't taking place. Bolivians, despite their often desperate circumstances, are anything but downtrodden. Much of the reason they take to the streets can be understood as the response of a people who have never had the seat at their country's decision-making table. But there are many places with marginalized populations who have a very hard time sustaining struggle for social and economic justice. You certainly don't have to look very far in this country to see that. Often with my partner and co-author, my late partner, Ben Cole, I watched first as labor unions with miners exploding sticks of dynamite, then indigenous peoples from over 30 lowland groups, then coca farmers, then urban water users, then protesters against gas exports to Chile, patiently walked hundreds of miles, or in some cases roared into the streets, enraged that they were being pushed around once again. Sometimes the demands were nothing more than a laundry list of grievances, but sometimes they pushed presidents out of office in both 2003 and 2005. But they never stopped, and they never gave in. Beginning in the 1990s, a neoliberal government backed by the United States, funded by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and committed to smaller government, undertook the type of decentralization process that this ideology had promoted worldwide. But with Bolivia, there was a twist, a community accountability component, and this provided a new space for popular movements to participate in government, albeit at a local level. As neoliberalism increasingly failed to deliver on its promises, protest grew bolder and was coupled with a reborn hope that something could be achieved through the ballot box. This process was what propelled Evo Morales into power in 2005. Young Evo was, and still is, head of the most important popular movement of the 1990s, coca growers protesting the U.S.-financed war on drugs. Not only was this policy a resounding failure, but coca growers effectively cast the U.S. as attacking a central element of Andean indigenous culture, the sacred coca leaf. This built alliances beyond their isolated rural areas that resonated with the poor all over what is a very heterogeneous society, particularly regionally and also ethnically. This process all happened very fast. Evo and his political movement, the movement towards socialism, only came into being in the 1990s when popular movements ran candidates in newly formed municipalities. Evo was elected to Congress in 1997 and then came in a startling second in the 2002 presidential elections, chosen by Bolivians both fed up with neoliberal policies and insulted by the U.S. ambassador, who publicly warned the electorate to steer clear of Evo or lose U.S. support. Evo joked that Ambassador Rocha was the best campaign manager he ever could have hoped for. The MAS built its legitimacy from an explicit self-identification as the political instrument rather than political party of the coca unions and their allies, as political parties were derided as not much more than tools for distributing spoils among competing elites. The definition of political instrument, however, has remained murky, and even though, almost inevitably, the MAS has grown gradually to come to employ the same tactics, similar tactics to previous parties, its major rupture with the past practices remains unprecedented. In early 2006, when Evo and his inner circle took over, many of them were union leaders with little formal education and experience in public administration. Others were middle-class Bolivians drawn from a small pool of trained people in non-governmental organizations that had supported the process of change, as the new government's agenda was called. They confronted an entrenched, poorly functioning bureaucracy that was based on political and personal appointments. This style of governing had always plagued Bolivia and was solidly entrenched in union structures and popular organizations as well. Although the MAS was committed to increasing indigenous and women's representation, it was confronted by supporters convinced that access to government posts was part of their spoils of victory. They faced other formidable challenges as well. Transnational actors, from the World Bank to the IMF to the United States, had long wielded power to the extent of very often dictating policy and shaping political decision-making. Domestically, the MAS faced diffusing opposition from powerful traditional elites. This is not what you would normally think of as an image of Bolivia, but there you go. There was also an urgency to address persistent demands for greater regional autonomy, both from local elites and from working class people fed up with all the decisions being made in the country's capital, La Paz. And like every government before it, the MAS had to negotiate with poor and indigenous people who all had enormous expectations of immediate and thorough change. But the MAS also inherited some advantages. Natural gas revenues had spiked before Evo's election due to a 2005 hydrocarbons law that boosted royalties and taxes, improving government finances significantly. Constant confrontation in the coca growing regions has subsided with the 2004 Cato Agreement, which allowed growers to cultivate a limited subsistence amount of the leaf. The MAS had considerable political leeway as well. The three other major parties that had rotated in coalition governments since 1985 were all in tatters, and Evo took power with the largest majority since the 1982 return to civilian rule. The new government's agenda was ambitious, propelled by the October Agenda, as it was known, formulated during 2003 protests. It called for the nationalization of gas and all of Bolivia's vast natural resource wealth. It demanded a new constitution, one that would reflect an indigenous nationalist agenda that protected the environment. And finally, it insisted on the extradition from the United States of mining magnate and former president Sanchez de Lozada and his collaborators who were held responsible for at least 67 deaths during the 2003 protests in El Alto. 9 years on, the MAS government has not only maintained its hold on power, but insists that it has completed the October Agenda. The National Hydrocarbons Company was rapidly resuscitated, but as Bolivia lacks the major investment capital needed to run the hydrocarbons industry, it now negotiates contracts with multinational corporations. This partial nationalization infuriated many MAS supporters who demanded a complete expropriation of all foreign holdings. The new constitution is perhaps the MAS's greatest legacy. Never before had indigenous women sat beside white men in suits to debate the country's future and its framing document. But unfortunately, it was an incredibly fractious and divisive process, and while ratified in a referendum, the resulting document is clumsy, contradictory, repetitive, and just like every constitution Bolivia has ever had, often ignored when the government deems it convenient. As for Goni, as Sanchez de Lozada is known, and his collaborators, his close allies in the United States government, particularly in the Democratic Party, have effectively circumvented any extradition attempt to date. However, a second extradition request was presented last July, and there is an active civil case against him in the United States. Another important holdover from the past is the tendency to concentrate power at the top. Caudillismo remains deeply entrenched, and Evo is called on repeatedly to solve conflicts as people want to speak directly with their president. Evo spends a great deal of his time flying around the country to inaugurate schools, health posts, and roads. This runs headlong into the MAS rhetoric of ruling by obeying, which suggests a broadly participatory, ongoing debate between the ruler and the ruled. Increasingly, government policies are defined by a small group of trusted insiders and often announced without much consultation, on occasion causing people to take to streets to force the government to back down. These dysfunctional dynamics have increasingly propelled the MAS towards co-opting social movements wherever possible. Mechanisms range from clientelism to appeals for loyalty. And they have also established government-controlled parallel movements when social movements have really caused problems for them. But the MAS was soon thrust into Bolivia's frequently tumultuous daily life. A major uprising led by increasingly powerful Eastern agribusiness sectors and elites in 2007 threatened to split the country in two. At its height, 1 million people, out of a country of 10 million, marched in the streets of Santa Cruz demanding greater autonomy. In exchange for restoring peace, the government was forced to scale down land reform, which had never been applied to the East. But the problems didn't just come from their sworn enemies. So-called cooperative miners have replaced the miners' union that had led the political struggle for greater social and economic justice for over 40 years. These co-ops are hierarchical with a wealthy leadership who can be seen driving Hummers through the narrow streets of the famed Spanish colonial city of Potosi. Pitched battles between cooperative and union miners have happened across the highlands, and the government has proved largely powerless to bring the cooperative federations under their control. The cooperatives have taken the mining union militancy of the past and merged it with neoliberal capitalism in its most brutal form, leaving desperately poor widows, fatherless children, and a toxic environment in their wake. These miners repeatedly blocked passage of a mining law promised since 2006 that sought to increase the state share of royalties and their taxes. A watered-down version was finally passed in May 2014 that postponed the contentious issue of raising taxes and addressing any environmental damage that they caused. Bolivia has experienced the same resurgence of indigenous identity as other parts of the Americas since the 1980s. Increasingly, indigenous people have come to reject a class-based analysis and return to what sociologist Silvia Rivera calls long memory, the 500-year-old struggle against invasion and colonization. This has given rise not just to demands from long marginalized lowland groups, but to more indigenous-oriented configurations, particularly in the southern highlands. While the MAS has always managed a discourse that mixes indigenous values with class analysis, it has increasingly found itself in conflict with indigenous people who have a different vision. Bolivia's underlying economic structure, I don't know if I'm on the right slide, who's to know? I skip one? Okay, well that's probably the reason. There we go. Well, that's mining though. There we go. Yes, it does work. Bolivia's underlying economic structure has not changed. The country still relies on extraction with virtually no value added, financed by foreign capital, and so it's China and India very often. In order to finance its social and infrastructure programs, the MAS has had to rely heavily on extractive industry. In a country with no income tax, 2/3 of government income stems from royalties and business taxes. While discursively, Evo will rail against foreign domination and imperialism, in reality, he has to be very careful not to bite the hand that feeds him. The most dramatic conflict this inherent contradiction has provoked is the 2011-2012 Titness crisis. That's the picture I wanted. The government determined that in order to diffuse the power of the regional elites based in the eastern part of the country, which itself was an isolated backwater until a 1954 road connected it to the rest of the country, it would open a new development pole in the northeast. The demands for roads connecting the isolated Beni to the rest of the country are long-standing. But the most viable route was through an indigenous territory that was created after a considerable amount of struggle in the early 1990s. So local indigenous people set off on a long march to La Paz in protest. When they were violently repressed by government forces, the country was outraged, and protracted negotiations and conflict put the road on what appeared to be indefinite hold. The Titness saga illustrates perhaps more clearly than any other the bind that the MAS is in any progressive country, any progressive government in a dependent extractive economy like Bolivia's is in. Expanding extraction is the only option the government sees to pull the country out of centuries of poverty. Extraction is not just entrenched in the country's physical infrastructure and political system, but it's a state of mind as well that fuels government decisions as well as popular protests. Despite all the obstacles, the MAS government has made impressive accomplishments. Many mirror policies adopted throughout Latin America, such as conditional cash transfer payments, including a stipend for keeping children in school and for women who participate in natal screen post and prenatal screening, and a small subsidy to the elderly. These have all contributed to remarkable drops in extreme poverty. These policies are part of the MAS government's deployment of the concept of vivir bien, or living well, that conceptually favors a holistic approach to human well-being. Investments in rural infrastructure, and this is a country where there's never really been any money invested in rural areas. They've been greater than any other previous government. While similar, though lesser investments have been made in the cities, where the MAS has perhaps stumbled or had the greatest difficulty has been in urban jobs creation, even though it has significantly increased the minimum wage. Much of the problem lies in extraction. Hydrocarbons, for example, while pumping funds into the government's coffers, doesn't absorb very much labor, and certainly not semi-skilled labor. And it has minor secondary impacts in the economy. And while Bolivia's wages are lower than all of its neighbors, it also suffers from exceptionally low productivity and a poorly educated workforce. And this makes finding economic niches for its products extremely difficult. Over 70% of the urban population works in the informal economy as day laborers in construction or selling small quantities of goods from onions to pencils on the street. This is not to say that the economy has not changed under the MAS, and in fact was not changing before the MAS came to power. Second and third generation urban migrants, particularly the Aymara, which are highlands in the northern highlands, have emerged as powerful traders, truckers, and cooperative mine owners. They're an important base of support for the MAS. So the traditional economic elite is in fact largely in place, but the growing economy has created more room for a new elite with indigenous background, characterized very often by a foot in both the illegal or semi-legal economy, a determination to avoid taxation of any kind, and an unfortunate degree of exploitation of their indigenous counterparts. The MAS has made some very impressive advances in an area that has plagued, and some might even argue defined, Latin American history, land reform. Despite modifying their original plans in order to quiet the Santa Cruz elites, the MAS has distributed and cleared title to more land than any previous government since the 1953 agrarian reform that broke up the large haciendas. However, just as that earlier effort, there has been insufficient technical support to the new owners. And like the region's other left governments, most of the land distributed was already under government control, rather than expropriated from wealthy landowners. Particularly in the East, the process has also aggravated tensions between campesino landowners of indigenous origin, but clearly wedded to the market system, and lowland indigenous groups that have been granted large swaths of territory. The lowlanders often see the highlanders as the latest colonial invaders, while the highlanders are often baffled by the notion of holding land not put into market-oriented production, and resent how much land these groups control. Even though the land reform process slowed after 2011, land tenure has really profoundly shifted the country's land use. For the first time since the conquest, smallholders control over half the land. The MAS has had less success radically transforming Bolivia's health and education system, although it has made considerable efforts to do so. Like so many healthcare systems throughout the Americas, including this country, Bolivia's disjointed and inadequate system resists any easy solution. Powerful doctors' unions determined not to relinquish privileges have proved a formidable obstacle. Nonetheless, the government has undertaken a pretty impressive, if uneven, expansion in public health coverage, particularly, again, in the rural areas. But I think the most interesting thing that they've done is that they've created a vice ministry of traditional medicine that attempts to marry Western-centric, doctor-centric medicine with traditional healing practices. And this is the first time anyone has ever, it's not terribly successful, but it is the first time anyone has ever tried to do this in the Americas. Education reform has not been terribly easy either. They started with a literacy campaign, and 500,000 people took part, which the government then claimed that illiteracy had been eradicated, but there was very little follow-up, unfortunately. Teachers' unions have resisted reforming education largely because of concerns about their abysmal salaries, terrible working conditions, and limited voice in everything that affects them, and very often punitive teacher evaluations. But again, interesting initiative has been the formation of 3 indigenous universities. Students who go to these universities, and I've visited 2 of them now, get assistance from both their community and from the national government, and they study topics such as agronomy and veterinary medicine, forest management, that sort of thing. Not only has the MAS appointed an unprecedented number of women to high posts, changes in Bolivia's constitution have made this country second in the world in terms of gender parity in their Congress. 48% women between the House and Senate in the 2014 election. Another really interesting innovation has been related to the coca leaf, and it's something that has never been done anywhere else in the world in a supplier country. It's basically applying a harm reduction approach to coca supply. Coca growers and their unions are a key component of the MAS base, and they've played a central role in both formulating this policy and administering. Essentially, any coca beyond the limited amount permitted by law is removed through community-controlled initiatives led by the unions themselves. The model has worked the best in the Chipari, where Evo comes from, and where the unions are strongest and fiercely loyal to Evo. Coca reduction is coupled with technical assistance in growing and marketing alternative crops, as well as infrastructure improvements. The model seeks to expand the legitimate market for coca leaf worldwide, and little Bolivia scored an important victory in 2013 when it gained international recognition for its right to grow and consume coca leaf. This has been in place for over 60 years, the prohibition. But the hope for international market for coca products still appears a very long way off. Nevertheless, the steady expansion of cocaine paste and refined cocaine, driven by forces that are far beyond Bolivia's control, continues to threaten the country's stability and security. Bolivia serves as a key transit country for the world's largest producer, Peru, to growing markets in Brazil and in Europe. Technical improvements in paste production have dispersed the paste manufacture throughout urban and rural areas all over the country. And despite record seizures, increased government financing, and international cooperating agreements, containing the mercurial cocaine trade is simply beyond Bolivia's capacity. In the cities, the urban poor have not seen the jobs, factories, and income that they fought for, and watched as a new class of successful traders become wealthy while the majority still struggle to survive. However, the MAS project was the first and most extensive in the region to prioritize indigenous women and rural peoples. Bolivia's middle class has soared by 1 million people, 10% of the population, and economic growth is greater than it has been in decades. Impressive gains have also been made in civil and social rights. Although there has been an alarming concentration of power at the top, with lawsuits and other types of attacks directed at perceived enemies of both the left and the right. This political style, of course, is normal in Bolivia, and the hopes that the MAS would be able to break beyond it in 9 years were unrealistically optimistic, in my view. It should be noted, however, that the continued emphasis on winning elections, and there have just been 2 elections in the last 6 months, both national and municipal, belies any notion that representative democracy still does not continue to articulate the political landscape of the country. Unprecedented economic growth coupled with infrastructure investment and redistribution meant there was little doubt that the MAS government would win the national elections again in October 2014, making Evo Morales Bolivia's longest-serving leader with the longest tenure of any incumbent Latin American president, which is remarkable in a country that 20 years ago was the most unstable country in the region. The IMF has announced that Bolivia is expected to have the region's highest growth rate through 2014, although, of course, the plunge in oil prices is going to have a negative impact. So while the MAS has sidestepped many of the big structural issues, and arguably was never really in a position to address them, it has developed a patchwork program constrained in practice by continued dependence on income from extraction. There's a strong criticism that the MAS government has simply returned to the 1952 revolution-era politics through repeated nationalization rather than forging a radical new path. But the caution that this government operates under is very widespread in the region, even in the more powerful and stable left-led countries such as Brazil and Argentina, demonstrating from my point of view just how very difficult radically transforming any society really is. Bolivia, under the MAS government, has wrought significant cultural and symbolic changes, and it definitely improved overall living standards, but it certainly has not been able to usher in the profound transformation of the economic and political structures that so many Bolivians struggled for. Thank you. I went to the last slide. Did I not go to the last slide? So, questions, comments? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, my question is is about female representation in Bolivia, which is a topic I work with. And this, as you said, the second country in the world with the largest percentage of women in the lower chamber.
Right.
53%, so it has more women
Right.
than men in Bolivia in the lower chambers. And what made me kind of curious was that they have this whole system there, and they have a mixed electoral system. They have proportional, part of the countries, the election is run by proportional
Right. Representation,
vote,
right.
and half, or a little bit more than half, by first past the post, so majority system. And I was very curious to know how did they manage to, and they have quotas for both, yes, for the majority and for proportional. How did women manage to get that? I always, it's because I work with that, so I thought this was a good way to ask someone.
Well, I just did, right before I left Bolivia in March, I just did a whole group of interviews on this, and because I'm hopefully writing a story about it. They struggled. I mean, that's really the basic. I mean, during the 1990s, they managed to get a quota law through at the end, 97, I think it was, a 30% quota law. But it was a real uphill struggle. But by the time the new Constitution was written, one of the things that happened in the Constituent Assembly was there was this effort to really make it broadly representative. So there were, I don't know if there were 50% women, but it was very close. So there had to be a certain number of indigenous people, there were a high number of working class people, and a very large proportion of women. And to form the Constitution, in which the Constitution then set up the rules that you're talking about, and they managed to get this through the Constitution. I mean, it is a very radical Constitution, you know, that they managed to formulate. This was in the early days of the Mas government, and it was a demand of the social movements. And arguably, at the beginning of the Mas government, the social movements really did have a lot of influence over government decision making. I mean, it was, you know, but a lot of people say, oh, Evo Morales introduced a new constitution. No. It came from the grassroots. It was he could not. He would have been chucked out of office if he hadn't held a constituent assembly. You know?
I suppose also because it's also related to the fact that the Mas has a large majority in parliament, yes? So
yeah.
Also that perhaps.
Right, and one of the last people that I interviewed was this woman who is like part of the Masca, a lawyer, so a middle-class woman from the Beni who is in the Mas caucus. And I mean, she was talking to me about they're going to work on pushing abortion rights, which I mean, anyone who works in Latin America knows this is a serious mountain to climb. And, you know, abortion rights, equal pay for equal work legislation. I mean, there's very little of this anywhere in Latin America. So it's quite impressive. Yeah.
One of the things that strikes me as remarkable about Bolivia is in many left-wing governments that are based on social movements, that when the government takes power, it sort of absorbs the leading and best elements of the social movements, so they tend to wither.
Right.
And it doesn't seem to be the case here in Bolivia, and I wonder... It
did happen. I mean, a lot of those people, a lot of the leadership, and part when you have these really Caldeísta sort of movements, you don't have that kind of middle-level leadership very often with very much strong formation who can rise if the leaders are pulled off into being, you know, ministers or vice ministers. So that process did undermine the social movements, and I think that it was the beginning of the process of the co-optation of the social movements that we've seen over, like by this point, by 10 years on. I think that the difference with Bolivia and Ecuador, for example, which is perhaps the country most similar to Bolivia, is that Correa did not come from the social movements, and so and the social movements in Bolivia in many ways were much stronger and much more cohesive and had been for a very long time. I mean, not that they weren't fighting and jockeying among themselves, but I mean, they were able to come together, you know, in ways and maintain that level of mobilization over a longer period of time, I think, than in Ecuador. don't know. Matias, am I right? I don't know enough about Ecuador. Yeah.
I'd like to get your opinion from, especially these interviews and the new constitution, about this movement of decentralization that Moss or Evo's government has really put forward in terms of, and where it came from and how successful it seems to be, in terms of moving decision-making back out to the provinces.
Well, the decentralization process started in the 1990s with the law in 1994 with the law of popular participation, which was part of this. It really was part of the neoliberal project, was to start a decentralization process, shifting the municipalities. A municipal system was set up, so there were 300, and now there's about 350, but there were about 320 municipalities set up all over Bolivia. And the idea was that there would be a devolution, and in fact it was actually very positive because it was the first time there was any money that ever went to rural areas, and there was a community oversight mechanism, which I mentioned in the talk, put into place. So those two factors suddenly actually empowered rural areas in certain ways that they had. They had been, Bolivia, when the miners' unions collapsed in the late 1980s, the leadership of resistance and for social change, just sort of went out the window. So decentralization is, I think, in place. When you...
No, but it's much more aggressively enacted now since Moss took power, so I was wondering kind of evidence you've seen, at least from the Senate.
Yeah, I'm not really aware of that. I've certainly interviewed rural mayors and stuff and been to rural, particularly in the Chapari and the cocoa growing regions. But I'm not aware of that process.
So in the documents that the Moss group has written in the last 6 years, they're not reinstating anything more aggressively. They're just enacting what was
already on the books. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
There's definitely more resources going to the countryside than there was.
Oh, for sure.
Moss.
But that,
and I'm just,
yeah.
No, but there was a radical change.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
It may be that Moss really took it on seriously and actually initiated that.
I think it was initiated nationally. It may have been administered locally, which would, of course, if there was more money coming in through the municipalities, it would have strengthened the municipalities. There was just municipal elections in Bolivia, and they were taken, I would say, in some ways more seriously than I've ever seen them taken before. So that may, in fact, reflect what you're talking about. Yeah. Somebody back there, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for your work. How did candidate Evo Morales use the media to coalesce his forces to become President Evo Morales? And then how has he utilized that media or whatever other communication networks are available to hold his government together? And the other part of that question is, how many women's voices were incorporated into his campaign and into those media sources that allows women to rise also?
Yeah. So, before Evo was elected, probably the strongest popular media in terms of working class and in terms of political organizing type of media was radio. And radio was largely used, very often funded by progressive parts of the Catholic Church, and was very widely available. And it would be everything from trying to find your brother or sister to, you lost your cow or whatever, but also a lot of discussion about health, education, and political organizing. So it was a real mobilizing tool, and particularly in the cocoa growing regions, the radios were a fundamental part of coalescing and tying together the popular resistance to the war on drugs. Not so much print media. You're talking about a population where there's relatively limited literacy. You've got a 500,000 people participated in the literacy campaign. So, and of course, increasingly as money rises, there's more television. When the Mas took over as it has been often the case, the media was controlled by the right wing. And in the first few years of the Mas government, I mean, you'd open the paper and you'd see that the right wing was, not just or they weren't criticizing the government, they were trashing the government. It's the only way to put it. They were like making up the most ridiculous things that were simply untrue, as opposed to saying, this policy is not a good policy because of X, Y, Z. And what the government, the strategy the government came upon in terms of both the television and the print media was that in a country that does not have a strong private sector, a lot of the ads were financed by different government ministries pulling out calls for tenders or education campaigns or whatever it was. So the government started pulling back the resources to a certain number of these newspapers, and so in order to, the shift is quite remarkable. In order to keep their heads above water, they started to become more and more pro-government, and some of them it's like this sort of like, how could this be in 6 years that a paper could have gone and not changed ownership, right? Gone from one to the other. I think that, like in the radios, there was, especially in the cocoa growing regions, there was a lot of participation, a lot of emphasis on women's participation, and even in the mining areas as well. Women really. There was always, among the social movements, there was always a strong current of women who would say, you'd say to a woman who was like fighting for women's rights that you were a feminist, and she'd look at you in horror, because I'm not a feminist, but they were doing everything that I would define as feminism. So now people talk and say they're feminists. It's kind of an interesting transformation. But so I think women were very involved very early on, particularly in radio. And it was a good voice for women because, more women were illiterate than men. They're higher or lower educational levels, right? As always. Yeah.
Yeah, you partially answered my question, but I wanted to know what is the role of the oligarchy now, and how do they relate to the government, and have they changed at all, or not, and maybe compared with other Latin American countries?
Yeah, I don't think I can answer that part so much, but the oligarchy originally were horrified that they were being, their government was being run by an Indian. They were absolutely horrified. How could this possibly be? And after a period of time, especially after this rebellion in Santa Cruz in 2007, where they negotiated their power base, they negotiated with the government to restrict land reform and to basically have the government back off the expansion of the agricultural frontier, particularly in soy. They began to realize, well, they could live with an Indian because he wasn't really going to affect their economic interests. And so that's really kind of the process that has happened. Also now in this last election, which has concerned a lot of people a lot, is that the Mas has started to incorporate some of the old politicos of that more right-wing conservative world into the Mas in order to establish a greater hegemony over the country. Yeah.
Also 2007 Santa Cruz. Is that called the Crescent? Is that what they call it, Crescent?
They call it the Media Luna, yes.
Media Luna.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, Crescent.
So, from what I understand, the landholders actually organized a tax strike, is that what you would call it? And how did the government negotiate their way out of that? And is that the reason why they have so few taxes today?
Well, as I understand it, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, there's virtually no income tax anywhere in Latin America.
So that was not their tax strike, it was already there.
Right?
No, that's wrong. In Latin America?
Well, where in Latin America?
There's the end of Peru or something.
There's.
Yes, there is.
All right. Well, then that's my misunderstanding. Yeah.
Somebody from the Crescent told me that they had not paid their taxes to the government, and somehow the government had defused the situation, but I don't know how they did it.
Well, definitely in Bolivia there isn't. I can say that.
Okay, so
I know, I know that when there was an effort to introduce income tax system in Guatemala by I can't remember who the progressive president was now. I'm trying to remember his name, but he was virtually chucked out of office. So there's been a lot of resistance in various parts, but certainly probably the wealthier parts of Latin America. That's obviously I read something that was incorrect, but. so there's a lot of resistance to income tax, and has been, and I mean, there is like a value-added tax, which is where the other part of the government's revenue comes from. But the government basically backed off, and then what happened was that there was a, every so often there's something that happens that outrages people, that sort of puts a huge roadblock, and this happens in every country, right? And there was a massacre in Pando, in the northern part of the country, and it
Physical
was
roadblock, physical people in the street.
yeah, there was like campesinos marching to a meeting, indigenous people, and they were set upon by, there was a lot of, in 2007 and 2008, something I had never seen before in Bolivia, there was a lot of like open racism. I mean, the society was deeply racist, but people did not like call each other names on the street. They did not, and so there was all this racial slurs going on. And I think 14 or 15 campesinos were killed, and this just turned the country against the right wing. It was like it had gone too far somehow in this like anti-Indian campaign, and they were a minority. I mean, it's a really crazy thing to do if you're a minority, to start, launching huge racial slurs against the majority of the country.
But they were killed by policemen or by landowners?
No, by landowners or
okay,
local
okay,
town,
okay.
light-skinned white people.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you've seen any improvement in terms of participatory democracy in the last couple of years. I did research on this through 2011 in El Alto and Santa Cruz, and it was very, very disappointing, at least in terms of urban reform. There was not much in El Alto. There's a very clientelistic system, and it seems like in the municipal election we got hammered for that happening. And I'm curious about the law of autonomy, which was just being put on the books when I left Bolivia, and has anything happened with that, either in rural or particularly in urban areas?
Well, certainly with the law of autonomy, that in terms of like indigenous autonomy, like indigenous autonomous regions, that has really pretty much stalled, and if not gone backwards. I mean, I think there were 13 or 14 about trying to do it, and now it's down to about 7 or 8. The clientelism in El Alto is, deeply entrenched and has been there for a very long time, and there are people struggling against it. But I mean, I don't see that. There's not. I don't think it's changed very much and since you were there, unfortunately. Anything else? Yeah.
One more question. In terms of the unions that are in the country and the oligarchy, how many families are the controlling oligarchy? And are the unions, are they owners of the mines, or are they owners of all of the raw materials, or what are they?
The traditional elites have been in the mining sector and construction and banks, and they basically still control, and agribusiness. Mm-hmm. So they still basically control all of those sectors. So the new indigenous elites will control trucking, cooperative, these so-called cooperative mines, and they're traders. I mean, they've been traders for centuries, but they've just become certainly as the country's become wealthier, they've become wealthier.
The question I was trying to get at was, you indicated that President Morales was not able to remove a lot of the ills from the culture, and it kind of reminded me of some of the expectations that people had in the United States for President Obama, like come in, all of a sudden there's going to be light and glorious,
right, and everything's
running down, doing a maypole dance every day,
right,
365 days a year. What I was trying to get at was what kinds of forces of violence was he facing when he entered office from those aristocratic elites and the oligarchy, and from their interactions with the United States or any other G7 nations.
Right. I think that was the uprising in Santa Cruz in 2007, which was incredibly racist, and vigilante squads out on the street sort of beating everybody up, or beating protesters up and that sort of thing. But Bolivia has had even when it's had military coups, it's not had the kind of level of violence or human rights violations you've seen in other parts of Latin America overall. Yeah.
I was in Bolivia last year, and I think that it has to be said that there is very much discussion and very many people that do not dare to say what they think, and a lot of people that have been working on the left through NGOs and also social movements that do not dare to say what they think. There are videos like Radio Deseo, where they speak up and put evil traitor on the walls and things all over. So there is, I think it's really, what I felt at least with the people I work with in the countryside also is that it's very strong affiliation. If you don't have the connections with mass, it can be very difficult, and the whole how do you say, the system of the ministries and all this, that it's very, very difficult to come in and use the knowledge that is in the countryside from the people that do not support the mass in everything.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's very strong right now.
There is a very alarming concentration of power going on. There's no question about it. Yeah, Matthias?
Could you talk a little bit more about the most recent subnational election, your analysis thereof, especially in light of the tremendous victory of the MAS at the last national election this past October?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, especially people who are very critical of the MAS, sort of saw this as like the first wedge against, MAS hegemony. MAS did not do very well in the municipal elections, certainly not compared to the enormous victory it had at the national level. But I think that a little bit more analysis of it shows that people can tend to vote very differently locally than they do in terms of nationally. Their local interests are like whether or not there's a sewer system or whether the water system, or whatever, the roads or the buses and so on and so forth. And the MAS did not put a lot of very strong candidates in at a local level. They just did not put the resources into it, and I think that people are very happy with what Evo is doing nationally, but we're not so happy. I mean, there's a lot of corruption in the MAS at the municipal level, not in every municipality, but it's the same old kind of thing. And so there's a lot of frustration, and people said, okay, check them out, and I think that Evo, and I think this is sort of a classic and very this was when I was there, a very disturbing sign was that Evo came out and basically threatened people and said, well, if you vote for an anti-MAS party at the municipal level, we will not provide you, the MAS won't work with the municipality. Which was basically say if you want, a water system or whatever in your municipality, you have to vote for us, because otherwise if you elect someone else, we won't work with them. Well, this actually, I think it backfired, which is a good sign. It's a good sign that they, people are not going to sort of take that kind of threat. But the fact that he made it was disturbing, Yeah.
Foreign policy. So I remember that Evo at the beginning regarding access to the ocean had tried to get close to
Chile
and try to seek like a peaceful solution. And then now there's a court case. Do you think that Bolivia can win? And if Bolivia can win, will there be other solutions besides this court case so that Bolivia can have access to the ocean?
I have no idea, but I've always said it's the only thing that all Bolivians anywhere in the country agree on is their right to the access to the sea. So it's a very strongly held opinion and feeling, but I have no idea. I mean, it's in a lot of ways it depends on Chile, no? and Peru, yes, of course.
We have time for only one more question.
Okay, maybe somebody who hasn't asked a question yet? Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. I just wanted to ask, a couple of people mentioned, you yourself mentioned, there's this dissatisfaction and disappointment with the mass government from various kind of people on the left, including some of the people who were initially involved. And I just was interested if you see any kind of potential for a kind of sustained political challenge emerging kind of from the left, the indigenous movement. Because it seems...
Hey, it's Bolivia, anything can happen. But not in the short term. I think that people are really demobilized and marginalized, and as the woman who is sitting here mentioned, a lot of people on the left, at least middle class people, you know, intellectuals, are really afraid that if they speak out that they will be attacked, and people have been attacked. I mean, there have been sort of spurious lawsuits brought against people and that sort of thing. I mean, I think that it's exaggerated. You know, people who say to me, oh, people of my age who say to me, oh, it's a dictatorship, and I look at them like, wait a second, you lived through a military dictatorship. This is not a dictatorship. We would not be talking in a cafe like we're talking now under a military dictatorship. But I don't think that there's a lot of room at the, I don't see it. But, you know, anything's possible.
Well, thank you, Lydia.
You're welcome.